Well, the lockdown in the country came down harshly on the street vendors as it did for many other workers. In the city's massive informal economy announced on 24th of March with just 4 hours notice. An empty city means that the city's vendors immediately lost their source of income and were confronted with the hunger and deprivation of some vendors. Fruit and vegetable sellers began venturing out after a few days without explicit permission and immediately faced police harassment. After a few weeks, the government eased restriction and essential vendors were being permitted to vend into the large part of the advocacy of vendor organization and activist networks. However, the cost of doing business as well as the risk has gone up significantly, with vendors not having access to wholesale markets and suppliers and having to spend more on travel costs due to travel restrictions in the cities. Also, with the lockdown still partially in place, the number of buyers have gone down and have earnings due to the harsh summer heat. Perishable fruits and vegetables also have reduced shelf life, so vendors are unable to capitalize on whatever produce they do have. The state has recently announced a stimulus package of 5,000 rupees crore for nearly 50 lakh vendors, acknowledging the grave impact of their loss of livelihood. The intended relief for vendors will be a credit loan that will provide an initial working capital of 10,000 for all vendors, but this is not sufficient. Instead of credit, the government should think of converting it into direct income benefit, a cash grant as livelihood support to start income actively in regular way. Well, the vendors need income support to be able to restart work. If they are not able to do so, how will they return the loan? In the face of the ever-changing crisis, vendor organizations have to step forward and advocate for vendors to be provided with the resources they need to be able to resume their livelihood. To this end, vendors organizations could consider the following an advocacy agenda. Meanwhile, livelihood promotion for all vendors, including those selling non-essential goods. The impact of COVID-19 has been very harsh on informal workers who have exhausted their capital and earnings in trying to feed themselves during the extended lockdown period. Vendors need to be able to resume vending for survival, and government should take steps to begin reopen markets and allow vendors back on the streets. Then the number of street vendors in Chennai has reduced by 34% during this pandemic, disrupting the sale of essential commodities at affordable rates of residents in many zones. Well, according to the data compiled by Greater Chennai Corporation during the COVID-19 pandemic, 7,965 street vendors who had been selling essential commodities such as vegetables and fruits have stopped their business in the past few months. Meanwhile, the street vendors are selling anything from food to clothes in a common sight across the country. These include but not limited to the tiffin centers. Once upon a time, office adda for many the fruits and vegetable sellers, the famous chat shops across the road, and numerous juice, chai, coffee points easily spotted selling on the street corners, footpaths, local markets, or even carts that deliver at home. In the present scenario, when the whole world has to stay at home, these vendors on the road are among the groups that are worst affected. Without the luxury of work from home, the livelihood of the majority is critically hit. A handful of these street vendors are still playing their part as the last link in the supply chain, making sure essentials like vegetables and fruits are still accessible, albeit this also entails being a front line of the risk. Meanwhile, a vendor on the road, often not affected in singularly, the act of vending usually involves multiple members of the family. The items vended, such as affordable food and clothing, are vital for the survival of marginal sections of the society, including urban poor. Street vending has also been a cultural insignia of many cities, and to those who can afford greater luxuries, also an occasional engagement. Safe to say their pressure is vital in keeping a chunk of our economy and its people going. While the estimate of the losses incurred by most sectors is analyzed in depth, thanks to the availability of excessive data and information about the formal economics, the plight of informal sectors is tough to gauge due to the lack of the data. This is best understood by analyzing the implementation of the Street Vendors Act 2014, which aims at providing the livelihood protection and favorable regulatory framework for the street vending in the nation, and is implemented by the local municipal bodies. Thus, despite all the good intentions, the actual benefit of special schemes such as credit linkage facility under Atmanirbhar Bharat and social security measures under Street Vendors Act may not reach the vendors proportionally. Of all the, unless implementation is strengthened, ease in policy implementation likely depends on having the right database of the beneficiaries. Although the challenge will be to assure this is in post-pandemic society with economic crisis already strained manpower. Meanwhile, the challenge also presents an opportunity to leverage technologies and innovative solutions for ensuring that the right database is collated and analyzed, simplifying the whole process for stakeholders, district administration, municipal corporation and Panchayat Raj department and beneficiaries. The street vendors are the first point of contact in the supply chain for consumers, and in a time when public scrutiny for hygiene is bound to be high, it becomes crucial to become and to provide appropriate training to vendors on safety and hygiene, and adopting innovation in vendors, certification on FSSAI standards to increase general public confidence on the street vending. The unprecedented COVID situation has paved the way to new approaches and innovations in problem solving. The local government too will have to adopt new mechanisms in order to sustain the economy and to support anti-via the last one in order to curb the damage of pandemic on the formal, in fact, on the informal sector. Well, according to ILO report, in India, more than 40 crore informal workers may get pushed into deeper poverty due to COVID-19 outbreak, and sectors such as hospitality, accommodation, retail and wholesale business services, construction industry have suffered drastic consequences with a decrease in production and loss of hours and employment figures. In total, 1.25 billion workers in these industries, more than a third, that is 37.5% of the world's workers, are at high risk. Meanwhile, the condition of low-paid and low-skilled informal workers is very worrying in the low and middle-income countries, where industries or service employ a large proportion of these workers who account for 61% of the global workforce or 2 billion people and lack social protection or a safety net as informal workers struggle to strive amid the current crisis. This is a good reason to believe that post-crisis period will put an end and additional pressure on the already fragile sector. The consequences of the COVID-19 outbreaks for the informal economy will continue. Faced with a protracted crisis, the world economy is likely to depress demand for the products and services from informal sectors and enterprises. Meanwhile, the impact of the pandemic and its aftermath on women street vendors has been foregrounded through a recent study conducted by the Institute of Social Studies Trust and Jan Pahal. The study aimed to understand the impact of the lockdown on paid and unpaid care activities of women workers, also the impact on the access to essential resources and services. There are roughly 2 crore, recent numbers estimate closer to 4 crore hawkers in the country. 1/3 of this population consists of women street vendors who mostly sell their wares in weekly hot streets, roadside stalls, or helping their families, husbands in the back-end work. The lockdown in the country came down harshly on the street vendors as it did for many other workers in the city's massive informal economy. Announced on 24th March with just 4 hours notice, an empty city meant that cities, schools, in fact the vendors immediately lost their sources of income and were confronted with hunger and deprivation. Some vendors, fruit and vegetable sellers, began venturing out after a few days without explicit permission and immediately faced police harassment. After a few weeks, the government eased restrictions and essential vendors were being permitted to vend due in large part of the advocacy of vendor organizations and activist networks. However, the cost of doing business and as well as as it's at risk. It has gone up significantly with vendors not having access to wholesale markets and suppliers and having to spend more on travel costs due to the travel restrictions in the places and in the city. Well, that was our today's Lifeline. Thank you for watching. Take care.